The farmer kneels in his field, planting seeds into the soil with care, every move showing his bond with the land. Suddenly he looks up and freezes. Kareen is standing in the same field, holding papers and maps, talking to workers about selling plane tickets and marking out a runway right across his crops. Bulldozers roar behind her, kicking up clouds of dust. The farmer rises in fury, his voice shaking with anger but burning with fire in his eyes. "What are you doing?" "This is my land." Kareen only smiles, adjusting her sunglasses in the sunlight as if his pain means nothing at all. The first thing I noticed wasn't the sound of the wind or the smell of corn in the air. It was silence. Or at least the silence I thought I would find. You know the kind of quiet that feels alive? Where the breeze carries whispers through the fields, and the cattle answer with low voices like old friends talking in the distance. That's what I came here for. That's what I needed. After months of endless noise in Washington, I wanted to breathe again. But instead, my boots sank into the fresh scars of tire tracks, and the silence I craved was replaced with the angry roar of machines. The pasture where I used to chase fireflies as a boy had been invaded. Bulldozers pushed dirt into long scars, and trucks beeped as they rolled backward, stabbing the air with each sharp note. Neon stakes marked the ground in perfect lines, an ugly grid carved into the soil my father once tended with his hands. And then I saw her, Linda Harris, HOA president, sunglasses flashing in the sun, arms crossed like she was unveiling a monument to herself. Behind her, workers painted thick white lines across my cornfield, lines that cut straight through the heart of my family's land. For a moment, I almost laughed, because what else do you do when the ridiculous stares you in the face? What's next, Linda? A direct flight to Dallas landing right behind my barn? But my laugh died before it could leave my throat. Because deep down, I knew what those lines meant. It wasn't just another HOA project. This was a runway. On my land. I stood there frozen, my gaze fixed on a single detail. The old tin rooster nailed to the fence. It had been there for over 20 years, its paint worn away by storms, wobbling stubbornly in the wind. My father hammered it into that post himself, saying, "The land remembers." I hadn't thought much of it back then, but standing there watching strangers carve up our soil, I felt the weight of those words. That rooster wasn't just decoration. It was a witness. And now it was shaking in the same wind that carried the sound of bulldozers. That was the first gaze moment, the kind that holds you still, that presses silence against your chest so heavy it hurts. I didn't speak. I didn't yell. I just looked, letting the pain write itself across my face, because there are some things words don't deserve to touch. I had come home for rest. That's all I wanted. A week of fishing in the pond, fresh tomatoes from the garden, maybe even a nap or two under the oak tree out back. Running the Federal Aviation Administration isn't a normal job. It's calls at 2 a.m. when pilots forget to file plans. It's signing emergency orders faster than you can drink your first cup of coffee. It's sitting in front of Congress while CEOs breathe down your neck. By the time summer came, I was spent. My soul was tired. This farm was supposed to heal that. But instead of healing, I found construction crews. Instead of peace, I found chaos. And instead of silence, I found Linda Harris, smirking like she'd just discovered oil in my soil. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, smug. "Well, well, look who finally showed up," she said, strutting toward me. "We've been making improvements while you were away." Improvements. That word hit me like a stone. Improvements to who? For what? I hadn't asked for this. My cattle hadn't asked for this. The land hadn't asked for this. Yet here she was, acting like she'd done me a favor, like she was blessing me with progress. She lowered her sunglasses just enough to lock eyes with me. "John, progress doesn't wait for anyone. This community is moving forward, and if you want to stay stuck in the past, that's your choice. But don't get in our way." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked past her. I watched the surveyor check his tape measure. I watched the workers space their markers evenly, in straight lines, and my instincts screamed. I'd seen layouts like this before, hundreds of times. Not a playground, not a walking trail, not even a new road. This was something else, something bigger, something illegal, but I didn't show it. Not yet. Progress, huh? I said, forcing a smile. What are we talking about? A bigger pool? A playground for the kids? She laughed like I'd just told the funniest joke in the world. You'll see soon enough. Let's just say this neighborhood is about to become very exclusive. Exclusive. That word clung to me long after she walked away, barking orders, waving her manicured hands like a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction. I stayed there, standing in the dirt, trying to convince myself I was wrong. Maybe it was just a new road. Maybe it was a bike trail. Something small. Something harmless. But deep down, I already knew the truth. No HOA in the history of this country has ever stopped at a bike path when they could chase something bigger, louder, and more ridiculous. Later that afternoon, I drove into town. The general store hadn't changed much. Same creaky floorboards, same glass counter, same old man Jenkins leaning back with a toothpick in his mouth. He peered over his newspaper as I walked in. "Back in town, huh?" he said. "Yeah," I answered. "Thought I'd get some peace and quiet." He chuckled. "Not with Linda around." That laugh told me everything. Jenkins never laughed without reason. It meant the whole town already knew something I didn't. I asked him straight, "What's she building out there?" He leaned back, crossed his arms, and shook his head. "Rumor is she's been talking about turning this neighborhood into one of those fly-in communities. You know, like down in Florida. Rich folks land their private planes right next to their houses." I blinked. "You're telling me she's building an airstrip?" "I'm telling you," he said slowly, "if you wanted peace and quiet, you picked the wrong farm." I drove back to the property with his words rattling in my mind. Flying community, private planes, runway, it all made sense now. Too much sense. As the sun dipped low, I walked the length of the pasture myself. The survey lines stretched straight through the fields, past the pond, ending near the tree line. Perfect length for small planes. Perfect alignment for the wind. Perfectly illegal. At dusk, I stood at the edge of the field. Crickets sang in the tall grass. Bulldozers growled in the distance. The smell of cut corn mixed with the bitter scent of tar. And in that moment, I knew two things for certain. One, my vacation was already ruined. Two, Linda Harris had declared war on the wrong man, because I wasn't just John Miller, farmer's son. I was John Miller, director of the FAA, and if Linda thought she could sneak a runway past me, she was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life. So before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If this was your land, if someone tried to bulldoze your family's legacy under the banner of progress, what would you do? Would you fight back? Or would you sell and walk away? Let me know in the comments. The next morning, I woke before the rooster crowed, though I didn't need an alarm. The sound of engines shattered the dawn. At first, I thought maybe it was a crop duster cutting too low, but when I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, my chest tightened. They weren't surveying anymore. They were building. A strip of land that only yesterday held my corn was now stripped bare, the soil flattened into an ugly scar. Trucks lined up like soldiers, dumping asphalt that steamed in the rising sun. Workers in neon vests pushed machines back and forth, pressing the ground into submission. White lines, thick and bold, stretched across the field as if they were claiming it forever. And there she was again, Linda Harris. Standing in the middle of it all, hard hat on her head, sunglasses reflecting the light, a smile across her face so smug it looked carved in stone. She barked orders with her clipboard, waving her arms like she was orchestrating a symphony of chaos. I walked across the pasture toward her, my boots crunching against the gravel they had already poured. "Morning, Linda," I called out. "Building me a new driveway?" She didn't even look surprised. "John, you should be thanking us. This is going to raise the value of your property. Imagine it. Neighbors landing their planes right across the street. The prestige. Planes? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean to tell me you're building a runway? She lowered her sunglasses, gave me that politician's smile. Not just a runway, an airstrip. A private airstrip for our community. This is the future. We'll be just like those luxury fly-in neighborhoods in Florida. I sipped my coffee, steadying myself. An airstrip across my cornfield without permission. My blood boiled, but my voice stayed calm. You do realize this is my land, right? She waved her manicured hand like she was swatting away a fly. Technicalities. The board already approved it. We took a vote. Majority rules. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. A vote? On my land? What's next? You going to vote on repainting the White House? She didn't laugh. She just tilted her head, smug as ever. Progress doesn't wait, John. You'll catch up eventually. Behind her, I saw the crew spreading black asphalt across what had been my father's field. I thought about him then, how he used to walk these rows at sunrise, inspecting each stalk, whispering under his breath about the weather, the soil, the seasons. He never said much, but he believed the land held memory and that it would repay the respect you gave it. That memory stung now, because here on the same soil he worked with his bare hands, strangers were raising aircraft instead of crops. 40 years of harvests, erased in the name of prestige. Linda turned back to me, lips curling. If you don't like it, maybe it's time you considered selling. There it was, the real motive. Not community, not progress, greed. She wanted the land, and she wanted it bad. But I didn't react. Not yet. Because while Linda was busy flexing her HOA power, she had no idea who I really was. And the longer she stayed blind to it, the sweeter this fight was going to be. That afternoon, I walked the site myself. The strip already stretched nearly 3,000 feet, perfectly aligned with the prevailing wind. Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing, which meant Linda had help. Someone with aviation knowledge. Someone willing to risk everything for a cut of her dream. The thought unsettled me. This wasn't just about her ego anymore. It was about power, about control, and maybe even money changing hands behind closed doors. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't only my fight. She was dragging the whole town into it. As the machines roared on, I leaned against the fence, staring at that tin rooster again. Its head bobbed in the wind, its metal surface dulled by time. It looked fragile, almost broken, but it still stood. Just like this farm had stood through tornadoes, droughts, and debt. Maybe that was the lesson. Maybe that rooster was the promise that the land would outlast arrogance. Still, the pain pressed heavy in my chest. I could feel it in my gaze as I looked out across the half-built strip. A silent pain, a reminder that sometimes loss isn't a storm or a fire. Sometimes it's the slow grind of bulldozers taking pieces of your life one scoop at a time. And here's the thing that kept clawing at me. They thought they had already won. Would you fight if someone bulldozed your history? Or would you walk away? Think about it. That night I barely slept. The machines rattled my windows. The dust coated the porch. The cattle stampeded to the far corner of the pasture. Every sound was an insult. Every vibration a reminder that Linda's dream was swallowing my father's land. By morning, another letter was shoved under my door. A violation notice. According to the HOA, I was obstructing community progress because my tractor was parked too close to the development zone. In other words, I was farming on my own farm. The fine was $500. I crumpled it and tossed it in the trash. But it wasn't just the fine. It was the way she turned it into theater. Every afternoon, Linda drove by in her shiny black SUV, rolling down the window just enough to call out, "Still resisting, John?" before smirking and driving off. And then came the sign, hammered right into the edge of my property. Painted bright blue, Future HOA Runway, Private use. Opening soon. I ripped it out of the ground and threw it into my truck, but the damage was done. The image burned into my mind. She wasn't bluffing anymore. She was advertising. That night I sat at my father's old kitchen table. The wood was worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee mugs. I spread out everything I had, deeds, photos of the construction, copies of the letters. The farmhouse smelled faintly of coffee and dust, and for the first time in years, I heard my father's voice in my head. Don't let them push you, son. Miller land is Miller land. I wasn't just a miller, though. I was also the man with the power to shut her dream down before it ever took off. But I didn't reveal it, not yet. Because there's something satisfying about letting your enemy dig their own grave while they laugh at you. If you were in my shoes, would you show your power now, or wait until they fall deeper into their trap? The days blurred together, more bulldozers, more noise, more harassment. Orange cones blocked my driveway one morning, an HOA safety measure. I drove straight through them with my truck, crushing the plastic under my tires. Workers gawked as I passed, but none dared stop me. Neighbors began to split into two camps. Some were furious. Dust coated their cars, windows rattled at night, sleep was impossible. Others were enchanted by Linda's vision, dreaming of cocktail hours while private jets landed across the pasture. And me? I was painted as the villain. Linda even said it to my face one afternoon, clipboard in hand like it was a sword. "You're standing in the way of history, John," she hissed. "People will remember you as the stubborn old man who killed progress." I leaned in close enough for her to smell the coffee on my breath. "Or maybe they'll remember you as the woman who built a runway on the wrong man's land." Her eyes flickered just for a second. Then she straightened, smirked, and said, "You'll regret this," I chuckled. "Linda, you have no idea how much fun I'm having already." But that night, standing outside with another cup of coffee, I looked at the half-built strip cutting through the pasture. To anyone else, it looked like progress. To me, it looked like a trap, and Linda Harris was sprinting straight into it. What would you do if your enemy thought they were winning, but you knew their downfall was already in your hands? The days wore me thin. The bulldozers rattled the walls, letters piled up under the door, Linda's smirk haunted me like a ghost. But through it all, I held my silence, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every inch of that runway was already mine to destroy. Not as a farmer, not as a landowner, but as the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And soon, very soon, I was going to remind her exactly what that meant. But before I could make my move, Linda made hers. The next HOA meeting wasn't just another argument. It was a declaration. She stood at the front of the clubhouse waving a stack of papers and smiling like a queen on her throne. "The community voted 73% in favor," she announced. "The airstrip is happening. The numbers don't lie." And then she turned her eyes on me, sharp and cold. "And if you get in our way, John, the HOA will fine you for every delay, every obstruction, every violation you cause. This is bigger than you. You can't stop us." The room went quiet. My hand tightened around the deed in my jacket pocket. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my land anymore. This was war. The meeting ended in chaos. Folding chairs screeched against the floor as neighbors shuffled out, whispering in low voices. Some avoided my eyes, others gave me small nods, like they wanted to support me but didn't dare in front of Linda. She stood at the podium with her papers stacked neatly. A smile plastered across her face, the kind that hides fear with arrogance. I walked out into the parking lot, heat rising from the pavement, the smell of fresh asphalt drifting from my land just down the road. Sitting in my truck, I let the weight of it all settle. Linda had the votes, the contractors, the timeline, and the neighborhood seemed split down the middle, half blinded by her promises, half too scared to fight. And me? I wasn't sure anymore if I was the farmer defending his father's legacy or the FAA director using his badge like a weapon. That was the crack in my armor, because power, no matter how righteous, always carries guilt. As I drove back to the farm, my mind raced. Every bump in the road felt like a question I didn't want to answer. My father never believed in fighting neighbors, even when they wronged him. He used to say, "The land remembers. Don't dirty your hands more than you need to." And here I was, ready to bring the full force of the federal government down on Linda and everyone who followed her. Was I protecting the land? Or was I crossing a line? The doubt sat heavy on me that night. I sat on the porch with the tin rooster swaying in the wind. Its shadow stretched across the dirt like a scar. I stared at it for a long time, coffee cooling in my hand. That rooster had stood for decades, bent but unbroken, and I wondered if I could do the same, or if I'd break under the weight of this fight. What would you do if the line between justice and revenge started to blur? The next morning, I made a decision that felt both dangerous and necessary. I needed someone on my side who wasn't blinded by Linda's speeches or bound by HOA votes. Someone who could see the truth as clearly as I did. That's when I called Mark, the young father who lived a few houses down. He showed up an hour later, his pickup rattling into my driveway. He stepped out with his ball cap pulled low and tired eyes that told me he hadn't slept much lately. His 2 kids had been waking up at night, shaken by the noise from the bulldozers. "John," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I don't know how you've put up with this. My wife's about ready to pack us up and move." "Don't," I told him. "That's what she wants. She's trying to push people out, force their hands." Mark leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed. "I know, but she's got the board in her pocket. Every time I raise concerns, she waves those bylaws around like they're the 10 Commandments. Makes me feel like I'm the crazy one for wanting my kids to sleep through the night." That's when it struck me. Linda wasn't just building a runway. She was building fear, using it like fuel. She wanted people to believe they had no choice but to accept her version of progress. I told Mark about the evidence I'd been gathering. Photos, videos, letters, even her speeches where she bragged about selling hangar space. His eyes widened as I spread the papers out across the kitchen table. "John, this isn't just wrong. This is a scam. He was right. It wasn't only about the airstrip anymore. It was about control, manipulation, and lies. And every time she pushed harder, I felt the guilt in me fight with the anger. I wasn't just battling Linda. I was battling myself. That night, I lay awake listening to the machines grind in the distance. The farm shook with each rumble, dust slipping through the cracks of the old windows. My dog paced restlessly at the foot of the bed. Sleep wouldn't come, no matter how hard I tried. Instead, memories did. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in the same field Linda was tearing apart. My father had shown me how to plant the first row of corn. He'd pressed a seed into my palm and said, "This is life, John, simple, you care for it, and it feeds you back." That seed had grown into a harvest, and that harvest into years of meals, years of survival. Now, bulldozers were crushing the soil flat, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I had already failed him by letting it get this far. Have you ever felt the ghost of someone you love watching to see what choice you'll make? The next day, Mark and I walked the property together. We followed the fresh asphalt strip stretching through the pasture. He crouched down, touched it, and shook his head. "They're not just guessing," he muttered. "They've got someone with aviation experience helping them. This is too precise." That sent a chill through me, because if Linda had someone feeding her technical advice, it meant she was deeper into this than I thought. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was strategy. "And that made her dangerous. Who do you think it is?" Mark asked. I didn't answer, but I had a guess. There were always people willing to bend the rules for money. Pilots out of work, engineers looking for a quick buck, maybe even someone inside the county office who saw profit in progress. That evening, another letter appeared on my porch. This one was more aggressive. It claimed I owed $1,000 in fines for obstructing development. Failure to comply will result in legal action. I crumpled it, tossed it onto the pile with the others, but this one burned hotter than the rest. Because it wasn't just harassment now, it was war on paper, written in ink designed to bleed me dry. That night, sitting at the table again with the papers spread out, Mark leaned forward. "So what are you going to do, John? Are you going to pull out the badge? Shut this down right now?" His question pierced me, because part of me wanted to slam the badge on the table, march into Linda's office, and end this whole nightmare. But another part held back. If I revealed it too soon, she'd spin it into government overreach, claim I was abusing power. The neighborhood might even side with her. I leaned back, staring at the tin rooster through the window. Its shadow flickered in the moonlight. "Not yet," I said. "Timing is everything," Mark frowned. "But every day you wait, she gets stronger. You sure this isn't about pride?" That hit me harder than I expected. Was I waiting for justice or waiting to watch her fall harder? The thought twisted in my gut. Would you risk everything to time your strike perfectly? Or would you act now and risk losing the war? Days turned into weeks and the harassment only grew. More letters, more noise. More dust coating the porch until I could taste it in my coffee. Neighbors argued openly now. Some whispered that Linda had gone too far. Others whispered that I was the problem, the obstacle standing in the way of progress. And through it all, my guilt grew heavier, because the truth was, I could have ended it. With one phone call, one order, I could have shut the whole thing down. But I didn't. I waited. I let her dig deeper, hoping the collapse would be so spectacular that no one would ever trust her again. And maybe, just maybe, that made me as selfish as she was. Then came the moment that pushed me past my breaking point. One morning, I woke to the sound of my cattle bawling louder than I had ever heard. I rushed outside to find them pressed into the farthest corner of the pasture, their eyes wide with fear. A bulldozer had cut too close during the night, smashing through the fence and scattering boards across the dirt. Dust coated their backs, their troughs, even the grass they tried to graze. I stood there, fists clenched, chest tight. My father's land, his cattle, his legacy, all of it under assault. For the first time since this started, I felt my control slip. I shouted across the field, my voice cracking with rage. Workers stopped and stared, their hammers falling silent. Linda emerged from her SUV, heels clicking across the gravel. "Morning, John," she called, voice dripping with false sweetness. "Looks like your fence couldn't handle progress." That was it. The last straw. I stormed toward her, every step heavy with fury. My dog barked at my heels, as if warning me to stop, but I didn't. When I reached her, I leaned in close. "You think this is progress? You're destroying lives. You're destroying history." She tilted her head, eyes cold. "History doesn't pay the bills. Prestige does." For the first time, I saw the truth in her eyes. This wasn't about community. This wasn't even about money anymore. It was about ego, the kind that devours everything in its path. I stepped back, breathing hard, my chest heaving with the weight of it all. My hand brushed against my jacket pocket where the badge rested. It was like fire against my skin, begging to be revealed. But I didn't. Not yet. Because just then I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A man in a county truck stood at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand, watching quietly. He wasn't part of the crew. He wasn't one of Linda's soldiers. He was something else. And when his eyes met mine, I saw the truth. He knew what was happening here. He knew it was wrong. But his silence told me he was involved. That's when I realized Linda wasn't acting alone. She had allies. People with authority, people willing to bend the rules. And that meant this fight was about to get much bigger than I'd ever imagined. The tension snapped tight in my chest, because now it wasn't just Linda I was up against. It was a network, a machine that could swallow more than just my farm. And the worst part? The next move had to be mine. The man in the county truck didn't move at first. He just stood there, clipboard in hand, watching like a referee too scared to blow the whistle. His eyes flicked from the bulldozers to me, then back again. He didn't say a word, but silence has a weight to it, and I felt every ounce. I walked toward him, boots crunching gravel, heart pounding in my ears. "You at the county?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. He adjusted his cap, cleared his throat, and finally spoke. "Name's Rick. I'm here for oversight." Oversight. The word stung. Because if the county was involved, if Rick was here with his clipboard pretending to be official, then Linda had more than HOA power. She had government cover, or at least enough to scare the average neighbor into silence. I stepped closer, close enough to see sweat bead along his temple. "Oversight doesn't mean looking the other way while they tear apart private land." Rick shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Miller, I'm just here to make sure safety standards are followed." His tone was defensive, but his eyes gave him away. He knew it wasn't right. He knew he was standing in the middle of something that reeked of corruption. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Safety standards don't mean a damn thing when the entire project is illegal." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might admit it. But instead, he tucked his clipboard under his arm, muttered something about schedules, and walked away. That walk, that silence, it told me everything. Linda had a friend in the county, maybe more than one, and that meant no matter what I did, she wasn't just playing with HOA rules. She was stacking the deck against me, card by card. That night, sitting at my father's table again, I felt the cracks widen in me. For weeks I had played the long game. Gather evidence, wait for the right time, strike when the collapse would echo the loudest. But what if I was wrong? What if waiting only made her stronger, her allies bolder, her lies deeper? The guilt cut sharper now. I wasn't just protecting the land anymore. I was gambling with it, and if I lost, I wouldn't just lose a farm. I'd lose my father's memory, the roots of my life, maybe even the respect of the people I was trying to save. Have you ever wondered if patience is wisdom? Or just another form of cowardice? The following day, Mark came back. He found me in the barn, tightening the boards on the broken fence where the bulldozer had crashed through. His kids sat in the truck, staring wide-eyed at the machines still grinding in the distance. "You can't keep waiting," Mark said, stepping inside. "She's not slowing down, and now the county's involved. You've got to make a move." I kept hammering, my knuckles white around the handle. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel this place shaking every damn night?" The words came out sharper than I meant, but I couldn't stop them. "If I move too soon, she'll twist it. She'll play the victim, rally the neighborhood, and then I'll be the tyrant who crushed their dreams." Mark stared at me, his voice quieter now. "So what? You'd rather let her win piece by piece? My kids wake up screaming because of those bulldozers, John. How much more proof do you need?" His words hung heavy in the barn air. The smell of hay and dust mixed with anger until I felt it pressing against my chest. I set the hammer down and met his eyes. "Do you even know what it's like to hold this kind of power? One wrong move and I lose everything. Not just the farm. My career, my credibility, everything." Mark didn't back down. "And what happens if you don't move at all?" "You'll lose the farm anyway. At least if you fight, you lose on your terms." The barn fell silent, only the muffled sound of engines outside filling the gap between us. For the first time, I saw it clearly. I was standing on a line that couldn't be straddled anymore. One step forward or one step back. Either way, something was going to break. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the length of the half-built runway under the moonlight, every step echoing against the hard asphalt. The crickets sang, the frogs croaked near the pond, but all I could hear was the steady hum of machines, even when they weren't running. I stopped at the far end, near the tree line. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. I crouched down, touched the black surface of the strip, still rough beneath my fingertips. It felt wrong, foreign, like a wound stitched into the land. That's when the breaking point came. My chest tightened, and I felt it. The rage, the grief, the weight of every letter, every smirk, every bulldozer roar. I whispered into the night, voice trembling. Enough! And I knew then something had to change. Something had to break. Would you rather risk your future, or watch your past be erased right in front of you? The very next morning I made a choice I couldn't take back. I pulled the badge from the drawer where I had hidden it, felt its cold weight in my hand, and slid it into my jacket pocket. The time for waiting was over. If Linda wanted a war, she was going to get one. But just as I stepped onto the porch, Mark's truck rolled into the driveway again. He climbed out fast, eyes darting like he had bad news to deliver. "They're holding another meeting," he said, breathless. "Tonight, at the clubhouse. Word is Linda's bringing in an investor from out of state, someone with money to pour into this project. If she gets that funding, John, this won't just be an HOA stunt anymore. It'll be unstoppable. Unstoppable." The word twisted in my stomach, because he was right. If Linda secured real money behind her scheme, even the truth might not be enough to tear it down. That evening, I drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was full. SUVs lined up like soldiers in formation. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the smell of burnt coffee and fresh ink from glossy brochures. Neighbors whispered in clusters, some eager, some anxious, and then Linda appeared. White blazer, sunglasses perched on her head, smile wide and rehearsed. She walked to the front of the room, microphone in hand, and announced with theatrical pride, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks a new step for our community. I'd like to introduce our newest partner." The door opened, and in walked a man in a suit, polished shoes clicking against the tile. He carried himself with the smooth confidence of someone used to buying power. His name was Mr. Daniels, an investor from Texas. And the way Linda looked at him, you'd think he was royalty. He spoke smoothly, promising wealth, prestige, and future growth. He painted pictures of neighbors sipping cocktails while jets descended gracefully onto the strip. And I watched the crowd lean in, some nodding, some smiling, some already sold. My blood boiled. This wasn't just Linda's fantasy anymore. It was becoming a reality, one contract, one investor at a time. I stood up from the back row, my voice cutting through the room. "You're selling a dream built on stolen land." The room went silent. Heads turned. Linda's smile flickered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "John," she said sweetly, "we've been over this." Progress doesn't wait for the past. I stepped forward, pulling the deed from my jacket, holding it high. "This isn't the past. This is the present. This land is mine, and no vote, no investment, no empty promise can change that." A ripple ran through the room. Some nodded, others frowned. Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow, studying me like I was just another obstacle to negotiate. Linda's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp now. "If you stand in the way of this community, John, then you stand alone." Her words struck deep, but I didn't flinch, because for the first time, I knew the line had been crossed. There was no turning back. "What would you do if standing your ground meant standing alone?" I left the clubhouse that night under the heavy Oklahoma sky, the air thick with heat and tension. My truck engine rumbled as I pulled away, headlights cutting through the dust. Behind me, the laughter and applause of the meeting echoed like a warning. The turning point had come. I had revealed my hand, drawn my line in the sand. Linda had her allies, her investors, her votes, and I had one thing left, my authority. But using it meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Back at the farmhouse, I sat at the kitchen table, the tin rooster's shadow flickering against the wall in the dim light. My badge rested on the table, gleaming faintly. I stared at it for a long time, my chest tight with doubt and certainty all at once. Because tomorrow everything would change, and once it did, there would be no going back. That night I couldn't shake the look in Mr. Daniels' eyes. It wasn't Linda's arrogance that rattled me. I'd grown used to that, but his calm, measured smile. It was the look of someone who already believed he owned the place. Investors don't gamble blindly. They bet on sure things, which meant Linda had promised him more than talk. She had shown him something I hadn't seen yet. I barely slept. By morning, I was pacing the porch with coffee in hand, staring at the half-built runway glowing in the dawn light. Dust clung to the air. Cattle bawled nervously near the far fence, and every sound carried a reminder of what I was losing. I kept thinking about Daniels's words, how he had painted visions of jets landing gracefully in the middle of my father's farm. Neighbors had leaned forward as if hypnotized. The dream was already spreading like wildfire, and I felt the flames licking at my feet. Mark showed up just after sunrise. He walked fast, his face tight with worry. "You stirred up a hornet's nest last night," he said. "Half the town's talking. Some are proud of you for standing up. Others, well, they think you're the one holding everyone back." I set my cup down on the porch railing. Let them talk. Truth doesn't care who's clapping. But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me. The truth only matters when people are willing to listen, and I wasn't sure they were anymore. Mark leaned closer. "Listen, John, there's something I didn't tell you. I overheard Linda and Daniels after the meeting. He wasn't just talking about investments. He said the county had already cleared the project." I froze. "The county cleared it? That's impossible. They'd need federal approval, my approval." "That's what I thought," Mark said. But Daniels was confident. Too confident. He said the paperwork was already in motion. I felt a chill. Someone wasn't just helping Linda with technical advice. Someone was forging paths through the system, making her project look legitimate. And if Daniels was right, it wasn't just her fantasy anymore. It was a machine rolling forward with official backing. What would you do if the system you trusted to protect you turned out to be part of the trap? Later that day, I drove into town needing answers. I stopped at the courthouse, asked questions, pushed through paperwork. Most clerks shrugged, others looked nervous. Finally, one woman slipped me a copy of a file stamped pending approval. The applicant, HOA Board of Meadow Creek. The project, private airstrip. And there, scribbled at the bottom, was a signature that stopped me cold. Rick, the same county inspector with the clipboard. My jaw tightened as I held the paper. He hadn't been out at the farm for oversight. He was out there laying the foundation for legitimacy, covering Linda with the county's blessing. No wonder he walked away so quickly when I confronted him. I folded the paper and slid it into my jacket. The fight wasn't just about Linda anymore. It was about corruption, manipulation, and allies I hadn't even known I was facing. When I got back to the farm, Mark was waiting. I spread the document across the table, pointing to Rick's name. "He's not neutral. He's working for them." Mark's face darkened. "Then we've got to expose him. If the town sees this," I cut him off. "If the town sees this now, it won't matter. They'll believe Linda when she calls it progress. They'll say I'm just scared of change." Mark slammed his hand against the table. "So what's the plan then? Keep waiting until the bulldozers roll through your living room?" I stared at him, the tension thick between us. For weeks he'd been on my side, pushing me to act. But something in his voice shifted now. It wasn't just frustration, it was fear, desperation. And then, in that heavy silence, a thought crossed my mind that I didn't want to admit. What if Mark wasn't just scared for his kids? What if he had something to gain, too? That night I kept watch from the porch. The moon hung low, silver against the black field. The machines sat silent, hulking shadows against the horizon. My dog lay at my feet, ears twitching at every sound. And then headlights cut across the pasture. A truck slowed near the edge of the runway. Not Linda's SUV, not the county inspector. It was Mark. I narrowed my eyes, watching as he stepped out, met with a man in a suit, Daniels. They spoke quietly, too far away for me to hear. But when Daniels handed Mark a folder and Mark tucked it under his arm before driving off, my stomach sank. The man I thought was on my side wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was in it. How do you fight back when even your friends might be part of the betrayal? Sleep was impossible after that. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the rooster through the window, its tin body wobbling in the wind. That symbol of resilience now felt like mockery. My father's voice echoed in my memory. The land remembers. But what good was memory if the present was being stolen right in front of me? By dawn, I made up my mind. I wasn't waiting anymore. If the county was dirty, if investors were circling, and if even neighbors I trusted were shaking hands with the enemy, then the only way forward was to act. And once I acted, there would be no turning back. I grabbed my badge, my file of evidence, and the forged paperwork. I drove straight into town, past the general store, past the courthouse, straight to the sheriff's office. The deputies raised their brows when I walked in, but I didn't give them time to speak. I dropped the folder on the counter, my voice hard. This, I said, is fraud. This airstrip is illegal, and the people behind it are manipulating the system. The sheriff himself came out, flipping through the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. He didn't say much, just nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant he knew trouble was brewing. But just as I thought I might finally have found an ally, he closed the file, set it down carefully, and looked me in the eye. John, you need to be careful. These people aren't just playing with paper. They've got backing, money, and influence. If you push too hard, you might find yourself on the wrong end of this. The warning felt like a punch to the gut. I had expected the law to stand firm. Instead, it sounded like the law was already bending. I walked out of the station, anger burning hot under my skin. For years I had enforced rules, signed orders, protected airspace. And now here on my own land, the rules seemed worthless. Back at the farm, the machines roared louder than ever. Asphalt steamed in the heat, white lines cutting sharper against the soil. Neighbors gathered at the fence, some snapping photos, others murmuring with excitement. To them, it wasn't destruction. It was progress, and that realization cut deeper than any threat Linda could throw. For the first time, I felt the weight of loss press harder than hope. Maybe I was too late. Maybe the dream had already taken root, and then, as if the day hadn't twisted enough, Linda herself appeared. She stood in the middle of the runway, microphone in hand, speaking to a group of neighbors and reporters. Cameras flashed, her voice carried over the machines. "This is the future of Meadow Creek," she declared. "A community where we don't just live, we fly. A community that isn't afraid to step into tomorrow." Applause rippled through the crowd. Daniel stood at her side, smiling like the king of a conquered land. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark again, standing with them, clapping. The betrayal landed harder than I expected. Because betrayal never comes from your enemies, it comes from the ones you trust. Would you fight harder if the enemy was no longer just outside your door, but standing right beside you? I didn't clap. I didn't speak. I just stood there, my gaze locked on the tin rooster swaying in the wind. For weeks it had been my symbol of resilience. Now it was a reminder of everything I stood to lose. And as Linda's voice rang out, as neighbors cheered, as Daniel shook hands, I knew the story had shifted. This wasn't just about an HOA run amok. It wasn't just about greed or arrogance. It was about betrayal, corruption, and power deeper than I had ever imagined. And whatever happened next, the fight would no longer be clean. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The applause at the runway unveiling still echoed in my ears as I drove back to the farmhouse. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, veins showing, the badge burning hot in my pocket. I had spent weeks gathering proof, weighing timing, debating patience. But now there was no more waiting. They weren't just trying to steal my land anymore. They had already claimed it in the eyes of the community. The sight of Mark clapping in the crowd stung worse than Linda's smug grin. Betrayal doesn't come with a warning. It comes with silence, with a smile, with a hand you thought you could trust. And now I was left with nothing but the truth in my hands and a storm boiling in my chest. That evening I stood on the porch and stared at the old tin rooster. Its wobble in the wind had always reminded me of resilience, but now it felt like a question. Could I bend without breaking, or was this the night I'd snap? I picked up the phone, called every official line I knew, every back channel I had built over decades in aviation. Some answered, some didn't. Most promised to look into it. Too slow, too late. By morning, Linda would have her investors filing contracts and her supporters singing her praises. The dream of progress was already rooted, and dreams, no matter how false, spread faster than the truth. The sun dipped low, staining the sky blood orange. I loaded every file into a worn leather folder, photos, letters, recordings, the forged application with Rick's signature. My dog barked as I slammed the truck door, but I didn't stop. Tonight, it ended. The clubhouse lights glowed against the dark horizon. Cars lined the lot. Neighbors gathered inside for what Linda was calling the final approval meeting. She had turned it into a spectacle, a celebration. Balloons bobbed near the entrance. Trays of food laid out like it was a wedding reception. I pushed the door open, folder clutched in my hand. Conversations fell quiet as heads turned. Linda stood at the front, microphone in hand, Daniels beside her, Mark a step behind. "Well, well," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "The man of the hour." I walked down the aisle, my boots loud against the floor. Every eye followed me, some with hope, others with suspicion. I stopped at the front, dropped the folder onto the podium with a thud. "You want progress?" I said, my voice steady. "Then let's start with the truth." I flipped the folder open, holding up the county form. "This project is built on fraud. This application was falsified." Rick signed off without authority. "And Linda Harris, your president, pushed it forward knowing it was illegal." Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors leaned forward, some whispering, others wide-eyed. Daniel's smile faltered, but Linda's expression hardened, her jaw tight. "That's a serious accusation, John," she said. "Do you have any proof?" I held up the documents, shaking them in the light. "Every word is proof. Photos of bulldozers tearing down fences, letters filled with lies and threats, recordings of her promises to sell hangar space. This isn't progress. It's theft." The room stirred, tension rising like static before a storm. A few clapped weakly. Others frowned, unsure. Mark shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between me and Linda. "What if the truth you revealed was the very thing that could burn your world down?" Linda reached for the microphone again, her voice dripping with confidence. "Don't let him fool you. He's not protecting this community. He's protecting himself. He doesn't want change because he's afraid of losing control." I pulled the badge from my pocket, holding it high. Its shine cut through the dim room like lightning. "You think this is about control? I'm the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. Every runway, every flight path, every strip of sky falls under my authority. And you built this runway on my land without approval, without clearance, without legality. This ends tonight." The room exploded. Shouts, murmurs, gasps. Some neighbors clapped, some yelled, some pulled out their phones to record. Daniel's face went pale, his hands tightening into fists. Mark stepped forward, but I raised a hand, stopping him cold. Linda, for the first time, looked shaken. Her voice wavered just slightly as she said, "You wouldn't dare shut down your own community?" I leaned closer to her, my voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "Watch me." The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. And then, like thunder breaking, the sheriff walked into the room. He carried the folder I'd given him earlier that day, the evidence stacked neatly in his arms. He set it on the table. "I've reviewed the documents, and I can confirm this project is not authorized. Construction must cease immediately." Chaos erupted. Some shouted in relief, others in anger. Linda dropped the microphone, her face drained of color. Daniels cursed under his breath, storming toward the door. For a moment I thought it was over, that the fight had finally reached its end. But then Mark stepped forward, his voice loud, desperate. "He's not telling you everything!" All eyes turned to him. His face was red, sweat on his brow. He looked at me, then at the crowd, then back at me again. "Yes, Linda made mistakes. Yes, the paperwork is wrong. But John isn't innocent either." He waited. He let this go on. He used his position, his badge, as leverage. He wanted to humiliate her, not just stop her. The room went quiet. His words hit like a hammer. Because they weren't entirely false, I stared at him, my chest heavy. He was twisting the truth, but not all of it. I had waited. I had timed. I had wanted the collapse to be spectacular. And now he was using that crack in my armor to fracture everything. What if your greatest weapon turned out to be the very thing that destroyed you? Neighbors shifted uneasily, whispers spreading fast. The applause faded, replaced by doubt. The sheriff looked at me, his brow furrowed, as if weighing every word in Mark's accusation. I opened my mouth to speak, but Linda seized the moment. She snatched the microphone and shouted, "See? He's not protecting you. He's protecting himself. He thinks he's above us because of his title." This was never about the community. It was about his pride. The crowd stirred, some nodding, some frowning, some backing away. For the first time, I felt the ground slipping beneath me. But then something unexpected happened. A voice rose from the back of the room. An elderly farmer, his hat in his hand, stepped forward. His voice shook, but his words carried weight. Pride or not, he's the only one who stood up when the rest of us were too scared. He's the only one who fought for the land. Maybe he ain't perfect. Maybe none of us are. But I know who's been lying, and I know who's been telling the truth. Applause broke out. Louder this time, stronger. Neighbors stood, clapping, some shouting in agreement. The tide turned, not because I was flawless, but because imperfection was human, and they finally saw Linda's lies for what they were. Linda's face twisted with rage. She tried to speak, but her words drowned under the noise. Daniels slipped out the back door, his dream of profit collapsing. Rick appeared at the edge of the crowd, pale and sweating, avoiding my eyes. For the first time, Linda looked small. The sheriff raised his hand, calling for order. "Construction is halted. The site will be investigated, and anyone found guilty of fraud will face charges." The room buzzed with shock. Linda dropped into her chair, her hands trembling, her empire crumbling around her. I stood there, breathing heavy, the badge still in my hand. The fight was over, or at least it looked that way. But deep in my chest I felt it. The story wasn't finished. Not yet. Because as the crowd slowly dispersed, as neighbors patted my shoulder and muttered thanks, I caught sight of Mark slipping out the door, his face grim, his eyes dark. He hadn't lost. Not in his mind. He had planted seeds of doubt, twisted truths, and whispered poison into ears that would carry it far beyond tonight. And I realized with a cold certainty, Linda might be finished. Daniels might be gone. But Mark was just getting started. What if the person you once trusted most became the greatest danger you'll ever face? Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. I stood by the truck, staring up at the stars, the tin rooster barely visible in the moonlight back at the farm. The land felt quieter, freer, like it could finally breathe again. But inside me, the storm hadn't passed. I had won the battle. But the war had only changed faces. And the darkest truth of all was this: sometimes victory feels like loss when you know the fight isn't over. The night after the meeting, I drove home in silence. The road stretched empty, the headlights carving weak tunnels through the dust. My badge sat on the passenger seat, its gleam dulled, as if it had absorbed the weight of everything that happened. Victory should have felt sweet. Instead, it felt heavy. At the farmhouse, the fields lay quiet. The bulldozers had stopped, their hulking shadows abandoned in the moonlight. Cows grazed cautiously near the broken fence, as if testing the silence to see if it would last. I walked up the porch steps, sat in the old wooden chair, and listened to the creak beneath me. For weeks, every sound had been drowned by machines, by shouting, by doubt. Now the stillness returned, but it carried the cost of everything it took to earn it. The rooster swayed above the fence line, tin body bending with the wind. Its shadow cut across the dirt like a scar. For so long, I had looked at it as a reminder of resilience. Tonight, it felt more like a question. What had bent in me, and would I ever straighten again? Days passed, and the town changed in ways I couldn't predict. The runway sat unfinished, weeds already creeping through cracks in the asphalt. The sheriff's investigation moved slowly, dragging through paperwork and testimonies. Neighbors stopped whispering about progress and started whispering about fraud, about trust, about betrayal. Linda disappeared from the spotlight. Her SUV no longer circled the streets. Her house looked shuttered, blinds drawn tight. Daniels never came back, his promises of prestige evaporating as quickly as they'd been made. Rick was stripped of his role, the county pretending they never knew him, but Mark remained. He kept his head down, waved politely at neighbors, played the role of the worried father. Yet I could feel it, the tension in his eyes, the grudge simmering beneath the surface. The runway had collapsed, but his bitterness hadn't, and that I knew was the cost of trust once broken. It never comes back the same. I didn't confront him. Sometimes silence is sharper than words. Sometimes letting someone carry their own bitterness is the cruelest justice of all. One evening, I found myself walking the runway alone. The asphalt cracked under my boots, grass sprouting defiantly through the fractures. I crouched down, pressed my hand against the rough surface, and felt the heat of the day still trapped within it. This strip of black had cost me nights of sleep, friendships, and the faith of a community. Now it was nothing but a scar on the land, fading slowly under the Oklahoma sky. I thought about my father then, his voice, his lessons, the way he had pressed a seed into my palm and told me to take care of it. He believed in growth, in patience, in roots that fed generations. What would he have thought of me using authority, power, and threats to protect his land? Would he have been proud or disappointed? The truth is, I'll never know. And maybe that's the cost, too. Some answers don't come, no matter how hard you fight. But as the wind pushed across the field, carrying the smell of earth and grass, I realized something. The land was still here. The oak tree still stood tall at the edge of the pasture. The barn still leaned stubbornly to the left. The rooster still swayed, and maybe that was enough. Maybe survival, not perfection, was the real victory. Sometimes the land doesn't need to win. It just needs to keep breathing. Weeks turned into months. Life found its rhythm again. The cattle settled. Neighbors returned to barbecues and small talk. The HOA meetings became quieter, less ambitious, more about fences and lawns than airports and prestige. No one spoke Linda's name anymore. It was as if erasing her was easier than remembering the damage she left behind. I stayed at the farm longer than planned. Each morning I rose with the sun, walked the fields, mended fences, drank coffee on the porch. The calls from Washington kept coming, of course. Pilots forgetting flight plans, airlines arguing over regulations. But here, they felt far away. Out there, I was the director of the FAA. Here, I was just John, the farmer's son, trying to hold on to what was left. One night, as the cicadas hummed and the stars spread across the sky, I found myself standing at the fence again. The rooster swayed gently, its shadow long and bent. I realized then that maybe the rooster wasn't just resilience. Maybe it was truth. A truth that things bend. People bend. Communities bend. But if they don't break, they keep standing. Even if they never straighten fully again, I let the silence sink in. The kind of silence you can feel in your bones. And I knew the story was done. At least for now. The runway had ended. Linda had fallen. And Mark, well, Mark would live with what he'd done. Betrayal has its own way of echoing back. I walked back to the porch, sat in the chair, and closed my eyes. The wind carried the sound of cattle lowing, of leaves rustling, of earth breathing. For the first time in months, it sounded like home again. The land had survived. So had I. And maybe that was enough. Have you ever looked at something broken and realized it was more beautiful because it had endured? If you've made it this far, you know this wasn't just a story about an HOA or a runway. It was about power, pride, betrayal, and truth. It was about what it costs to stand your ground when everything is stacked against you. And it was about the scars we carry on the land in our hearts that remind us of what we fought for. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced something that tried to take away what mattered most? Have you ever had to choose between silence and standing up? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one, and if you believe stories like this need to be told, if you believe communities deserve to hear the truth behind HOA madness, then subscribe to HOA Truth Tales. Share this video with friends who've lived through their own battles. And don't forget to hit that like button, because every time you do, it helps stories like this reach more people who need to hear them. Until next time, remember this: the land remembers. And so do we.